And I think the first thing to mention, I forgot to mention this because I'm used to not being on top of it like this from our last class, is I'll get this posted if it isn't already, or get you guys a link to it and get the stuff updated. There actually is a syllabus of like the material we're covering for this class and the rough outline. So we did an introduction in the last class. This one, the first like lesson, depending on how fast we move through stuff, is sort of a React overview and then a little bit of background in web development history. Then we'll talk about components, which is this core fundamental concept in React. That's a separate one. Then we've got this thinking in React. We may or may not even have a dedicated class to that versus just putting it at the start of something. I've already asked you guys to read through that section within the React documentation. But I think it's really important to emphasize that. It goes back to what I've talked about a lot in all of the other classes, which is learning how to put stuff together, how to break things apart is a more universal skill than learning one specific technology, because that will apply across a lot of different things. Then we'll get into some of the more specific aspects of React, dealing with props, dealing with class components and state, some of the component lifecycle logic. All of this is sort of the core of React. I don't have any plan to cover some of their newer concepts that they've been introducing, but we might touch on them here and there, as it's just a little more complex and not something that you're actually probably going to be doing quite as often just yet. But it's starting to gain some traction. So I'll get this posted. Again, it might already be out there from the last class, so I'll just have to update some links and stuff. But yeah, any questions about that? Just what we have there? And these roughly correspond to lessons or like classes that we'll have, each one talking about some of this stuff. All right. So this will be a little bit of repetition from last class, but again, trying to really hammer this stuff in, get you guys to think about this. Ooh, hold on. There's a problem with this, what I use for my streaming of my notes software. It switches to whatever tab I have open in there. All right. So React overview. This is really going to be a deep dive into JSX and some of just a background of web development a little bit. I don't have an icebreaker today. So we already built out this basic React application, right? This is a little hard to see. Can you guys see that? All right. We built out this much of a React application, or at least, I was showing you guys this much of a React application in class the other day, where I just have this React DOM.render and h1 hello world document.get element by ID. I don't know if that's, oops. I did not want to lose my my link to my other stuff, so I'll need to reopen this, sorry. There we go. We're going to discuss the React DOM object more later, just like I said before, but let's talk a little bit about what the spec of it is, because this is your starting point, like an entry point into your React application. So we at least need to understand what that looks like. And there's two pieces to it. React DOM.render has these two properties. The first one is the element, which is just a React element to render. And the next argument to it is your container. And what it means by container is a reference to a DOM element where the React application is going to live. I don't think I have this in the notes, but one of the interesting things about React is using React DOM.render is you don't have to have only one React application on a page. It's pretty typical that you only do, but you could put a whole bunch of different React applications using this React DOM.render at different places on a web page. And the reason you would typically do that is you've got an existing framework and you're trying to move to React. So you want to do it sort of piecemeal, bit by bit. So this is great, but obviously the question is like, what is this React element? We talked about sort of glossed over components in the last class, but I don't think we ever actually discussed what an element is. So the React element is actually the smallest building block of the React application, and it's just a plain JavaScript object, just like any other JavaScript object. They are immutable though, and what that means is we've talked about const and how you can't change the value of something that's been used const to declare it. That's basically what it means, is you can't change the value of anything about a React element. So it's an object that exists, but once it's been rendered, there's nothing you can do to change it. And it's usually created using the JSX syntax. Do you have any questions at any point? Let me know. You can put your hand up. I'll stop and talk about it more. So the JSX is a lie. This is just the way I like to think about it. JSX looks like HTML and it writes like HTML, but it's not HTML. So it's important to remember that distinction. It's going to feel like HTML, it's going to write like HTML, but there are things that are going to be different about it. So don't assume that everything that you know about HTML is true about JSX or vice versa. Really what it is, again, this is pretty much the same definition we had last class, is it's a syntax extension for JavaScript that makes it easy to define React elements that compile the JavaScript. So it's a lot easier to write some JSX than it is to try and write this stuff out by hand. Let me try and give you an example of that again. I think this will work. Let's see if I can do this. Ah, here we go. Yeah, it's already there. This is some JSX. So it looks like HTML again, but it's really not. And this is what it compiles down to in JavaScript, which I'm sure you can see is nowhere near as clean and easy to read as what we have on the left side, right? On the left side, you can see the structure. You can see what's nested inside of things cleanly. You don't have all of this extra like create element clutter. But over here, it gets really complex and convoluted. So all JSX is doing is making it nice and clean and easy for us to write this stuff so that we can think in a way that works well for us. And then the computer does what it does well, which is convert that to the code that is sort of ugly. I think this was just an example. Some of the interesting bits about JSX, which I think we have some slides specifically on it. Oh, there we go. It's literally this one. It allows embedding expressions similar to template literals from JavaScript, where we use the backticks, and you could embed with the $, curly brace, except in JSX, all you have to do is use curly braces. And anything inside of that will be evaluated as JavaScript instead of as part of the JSX. And then it will return the result of evaluating that. So you don't have to use the backticks, you don't have to use the $, you can just embed it just like that. Those could have been variables as well. Anything else works inside of that. It's just evaluating that as a standard JavaScript expression. Any valid JavaScript expression can be embedded in it. Look, see, I emphasize it even more. So if let me copy these and we can look at them. Maybe I'll even just put them over here, although it may have some problems with it. Oh, I've got a lot of other stuff here I don't need. I'm using this just to show you what it ends up compiling down to, or that it's running code. You could use, perhaps the easiest environment, honestly, might be the REPL.it site. So if you go there, if you want to do development locally, I think that's fine. It's really not, I don't think it's particularly challenging, but it can be a challenge to support that many environments. So locally might be the best, but if you want to remove any of the complexity. On REPL IT, you can do sort of this like new REPL, and then you can literally choose out of this list. I think it even has like a React option, and that'll have a whole bunch of presets already there for you to be able to build out something using React. I also have some links. Some of the exercises that we're doing, at least early on, are just links to code pins, I believe. I need to ensure that they're still functional. They were created a while back, but yeah, I've got some code pins that are intended for you to just follow that path and then be able to change it to make it work. So that should work pretty smoothly no matter where you are. But this is just an example of a more complex bit of code being embedded, right? So here inside of this JSX and inside of the escaped statement, we're actually invoking the function compute hypotenuse and putting the results of that in that location. So you can embed any arbitrary bit of JavaScript inside of these curly braces when you're working in JSX. One important thing that's different than HTML, at least most versions of HTML, is JSX tags must be closed. What that means is, if we go back here, you've got an opening tag and a closing tag, this /div. So JSX has to be closed or it's going to be invalid and it won't be able to evaluate it. A lot of times in HTML, your browser's smart enough to deal with invalid stuff where you didn't properly close it. But that doesn't mean that you have to always have content, because copy this row. Let me put this over here. Didn't realize this stuff might be just because I'm zoomed in actually even. But you can have what's known as a self-closing tag for tags that do that. So we did that in HTML as well, but you have to have that if it's a single tag. So you have to have this slash before your closing arrow for your tag if it's a self-closing tag. If you're missing that, then it's going to be an error in your JSX. It's going to cause a problem. And then this is where we start getting into some of the power of JSX, and we'll really dive into this in, I think it's sort of a couple lessons out, but JSX supports attributes similar to HTML attributes. So you know, we could add a class to an HTML element, we can add an ID, we can add a style, or really sort of any attribute. JSX supports the same thing. So you can get rid of all that. You can put attributes on it. So here's a title attribute that we've added to this JSX button element. And here is an on-click event handler attribute that we've added. Now, if you've done web development in the past, I don't think a lot of you have, but one interesting thing about JSX and React that I'll highlight right now is a long time ago when we started doing web development and web pages and we added event handlers, it was like, oh, how do you hook up an event handler? Where you just put like an on-click right in your element, and then you put your JavaScript that you want to run, and that's great. And then that became like bad practice. It was like, don't do that, because you can only have one of those, and you end up having to embed it in your code, and it's hard to follow, and it doesn't work well. And so instead what you do is hook up your event handlers in your JavaScript by getting a reference to your HTML element and attaching an event handler to it using that mechanism. And JSX has sort of moved back to you can just attach them directly inside of the JSX. And the reason is because in reality, it's doing the complex bit behind the scenes where it's like, oh, don't attach them that way because of problems with it. Behind the scenes, it attaches them using the better way of attaching them, but you get to, when you're writing JSX, hook them up in the way that it's a lot of times easier to see the event handler and understand what's going on, which is one of those sort of nice aspects of working with it. One difference between JSX attributes and HTML attributes is that since JSX is sort of embedded in JavaScript, it follows the more JavaScript convention of camel casing. as opposed to HTML, which is going to be lowercase. So if you're familiar with this, like an on-click in HTML would have been written with a lowercase c, but in JSX, you want to write it with the uppercase C, because that's the convention for JavaScript, and that's how the DOM maps things like event handlers into the JavaScript library, is with the uppercase language. And one other one that's really important, and I guarantee you, if you start writing a lot of this code, you're going to make this mistake. I've made it, I can't tell you how many times, and still make it frequently, is when you're adding classes to something in JSX. So if I wanted to add a class to this button that I have here, traditionally in HTML, I would do class equals like button or something. But in JSX, you should do class name instead of class. And the reason for that, without getting too technical, is because class is a reserved word in JavaScript. And so by using class, it can create some problems in the code. And so they just said, just use class name. I can't remember, I need to look at it. They may have done some work in the JSX specification to allow you to use both, but I would say just stick with class name, because it's one of those gotchas that will trip you up otherwise. So any questions so far on just the use of just JSX syntax? This is really, there's a lot of stuff that I like about React, but this is one of those ones that just makes things easier than a lot of other front-end languages, because you're able to just sort of nest your what looks like your markup right in line with your components, and so it puts all this stuff that you care about together in one place. Just makes it easier to read than some of the old models, I feel. All right, I think we're gonna fly through this, and we'll probably be able to work through some of the next one too, which I haven't reviewed yet, but we'll work through it, and if there's anything that I need to update, we can handle that then. But so I want to give you guys a little bit of background that's going to put React in context of web development here, because I think it'll help you understand what makes React unique again, and what are some of the benefits of it. So web development history, we've been to this page quite a bit, right? This first web page on the internet. It's a very simple web page. Originally, web pages were all static. What that means is, they just wrote a file, and it's just a document. It's just this HTML document sitting on a web server somewhere, and they're just created ahead of time. Somebody types the thing out, like, a little Word document, and then they just put them up there and put some links between them. And that's the way that the first web pages worked. Almost like just navigating around on your file system. So obviously that's very limiting in terms of what you're able to do, because how am I able to render a different information for different users, or how am I able to dynamically add information as stuff gets updated on some backend? Like, people have added files, and I want to get a list of files. How do I update that dynamically? So the first solution that the internet had for this, or web, was server-side rendering. So what would happen is you'd request a web page, and the server would have some code running that's going to do some logic. Oh, I need to go check the list of files, and then grab all of those, and then I'm going to render that into some HTML that I'm going to return, right? So it's very much like a static page to the web browser, because it just gets back an HTML file. It's not getting back anything that's it needs to do any extra computation on. But on the back end, there's computation happening. I thought I had more on that one. So the pros of that, right, is the initial page load can be really fast, because you're running with a very optimized language. Everything you're doing is really optimized for serving stuff up, which is awesome. And there's no state transition logic, because if each web page is just to the browser is just an HTML file that it renders, it never needs to know, how do I go from one state of my page to another state? It just says, oh, I got a whole file, just render that on the screen and I'm done, right? So there's no, oh, I was in this state, somebody had toggled a switch off, somebody had check this button, and now what do I do? None of that needed to exist, which is really nice in terms of your rendering process. But the cons are you have almost no interactivity when you're doing this server-side rendering, because how can somebody interact with something that requires some sort of state management? And page transitions can be slow because of network speed, right? Like the initial load might be fast of certain pages, but as you're transitioning, you have to pull down all of the HTML again. And that may mean you're pulling down a lot of stuff that you've already rendered. Imagine a page that has the same header on every web page, or every portion of it, the same footer, the same content on the sides, and it's just something in the middle that's changing. Well, with a totally static server-side rendered site, it has to pull down all of that markup every time. So that can be slow. And it can be hard to scale as well, because again, there's a lot of computation happening on the back end for every render, and that can be a challenge. So we introduced JavaScript to web pages, right? And at first, if you read I think it's hilarious to read some of the early developers of JavaScript about what they thought it was going to be used for versus where it is now. Because they'll say things like, we envisioned the only thing JavaScript would be used for is to make a little monkey dance when you click something on your web page next to the cursor or something, right? Like, they didn't imagine like the super complex web pages that we've built out. But what it allowed, by having a programming language that's read in your browser and that it's processing to change the web page, is it allows interactivity, because now you've got mutable state. You're able to change something on your web page by changing your HTML and forcing the browser to re-render it. It lets you do something that you really can't do at all with a pure server-side rendered, except for with some CSS support that has it, which is animation. Because how can you animate something with a page that just rendered, all the data came up once? It allows this mutation, right? Oh, delete this, and the whole page doesn't have to re-render. It just removes that one item out of a list. And that's awesome. At first, it was just used for enhancing these server-side rendered pages, right? Little things that we added in. Oh, a little bit of animation here, a little tweak there. Give me some highlighting, or bouncing stuff around, change some positioning. But over time, the interaction needs got more complex, and needs for just fast sites, like to be able to interact with them very quickly without a long delay. And so more and more work got pushed to the front end. And around this time is when a lot of like what were called Web 2.0 sites came about. So these are all the things like Gmail, or if you want to think like Google Docs, these types of websites that really couldn't have existed with the predominantly server-side rendered logic. And as they just kept putting more and more stuff on the front end, they realized, oh, we can do some really powerful things just inside of the browser, which is awesome. And that led to, again, this is what I'm talking about, like Google Docs is rise of the single page applications, or what's referred to as a SPA in web development. So if you hear that term, that's what that means. And a SPA is almost all of the UI or HTML is actually created on the front end in JavaScript. So instead of the web server sending back the HTML that you're going to render, the front end figures all of that out, and instead the back end is just sort of returning raw data. So when you go to, let me see here. I don't know if I'm logged into Twitter. Let me see if this is an example. I may or may not be. Oh, look, I actually am. I never actually used this. If we come here, I hope they don't make me look like a fool by making me look like they lied here. But if we go to Twitter and look at what's actually happening, this XHR, these are pretty much just data fetches. So let me see here. No data available. Let me try and find a good one. So instead of this is what I'm talking about here. Instead of this Twitter returning HTML, it just returned this object of data. Here's all of the tweets with all of the bits of data on them. Oh, here's who posted it. Here's what the text is, here's the time, here's the source markup, some bits, but that's not HTML that the browser can render, right? That's just a JavaScript object of some kind. And that's the way that these SPA applications work for the most part, is instead of getting back pre-rendered HTML, they get back data, and then the JavaScript on the front end takes that data and converts it into the HTML, the markup that you see on the web page. It says, oh, for each one of these notification or messages, create something that looks like this. And I mean, that's awesome because it allows the creation of these sites that you couldn't have, these word processors, infinite scroll like Google Images can just fetch more data bit by bit, or Gmail. And smaller network requests once you've got all of that, right? It could be larger initially because you have to pull down all of this code to render your web page. But once you've got all of that JavaScript code and everything else, the network requests are just the data. You don't have to include all of the markup and everything else. So it can make it much more dynamic over time. But there's some drawbacks with it mostly from a development workflow. The initial load time is probably slower because you have to fetch all of the code to render your web page. So instead of it all being done on the server, you're having to pull down a lot of code to do that. But the real drawback from a developer perspective is there's a lot of complex state management. Because if what we're doing is, we go back to Twitter and you're like, oh, hide this or dismiss this, or you're in Gmail or something, oh, delete this item, and then a lot of times they'll even give you like an undelete button down at the bottom to be able to undelete it for a while. There's a lot of complex state there. Oh, I need to delete that from this list. Do I re-render the whole list? Do I do something else to get rid of it? Do I need to, somebody clicked on this, do I now need to change a class so that it doesn't look like it's been read, or it looks like it's been read, etc., right? And that can get much more complicated as it grows because a lot of times the logic there needs to care about what the previous state of the web page was. Oh, what state was it in before, and what state do I need to go to? Which is quite a challenge when you're writing the code for these sites, and can quickly expand how many like if cases you have to have. And if you talk to a lot of experienced programmers, if else type statements are one of the most dangerous things in code. I know we write them a lot, but every time you put one of those in your code, it's another branch you have to test to make sure that your code works correctly. And when you nest them, it multiplies like exponentially. So an if inside of an if goes from like, oh, there's 2 branches to there's 4 branches. And now if I put another one inside of there's potentially 8 different paths that you can take through code. And that's what happens with a lot of these SPA sites very quickly, is you've got this complex logic that's hard to maintain. So what React did is sort of this combination, if you will. It lets the developer act like the page is a server-side rendered or static page, more or less, and it just gets completely re-rendered with each state change. So instead of you necessarily having to care, like what state was I in before and how do I get here? That's this declarative versus imperative. It just has the framework handle what's changing between them. So the framework does all of that logic for you, and you get to just say, just render this state. Don't worry about it. And it's really one of the biggest pieces of magic in React. It's what makes it different than a lot of the other front-end models. And again, we won't dig super deep into this right now, but the way it does that is this virtual DOM concept, where it's actually diffing what changed behind the scenes. So it's doing a comparison. Like if you've ever turned on like, I don't know, change tracker in your word processor when you're editing a file, and it'll say, oh, these lines were changed, this was changed. That's pretty much what React is doing behind the scenes whenever it does this full re-render, is it re-renders everything, compares it against the actual state of the web page, and then says, oh, it's actually only these 3 lines that changed. So instead of re-rendering everything, which would be expensive, I'll just change those 3 lines for you. But you don't have to worry about how to change those 3 lines correctly. It does that logic for you. Yeah, that was the stuff from this first lesson. Again, we may be consolidating some of these if let me know if I'm moving too fast or not. I think these were 1 hour lessons last time we did this, so we may put some of these together instead. Any questions or thoughts on what we covered so far? Yes. Yeah, I'm gonna post all of this. It's all, I think it is already up somewhere. I just need to either find the link, or if it's not, it's literally just pushing it to GitHub, because this is the same material that I used last time so far. I'll be updating some of it as we move along, but the initial material should be pretty much the same. Yeah.
What would be a real world example of state change in that program? Like if you're filling out a form, as you mark each section of the form, and that would be considered a state change each time you're changing one little aspect?
Yeah. Yeah. Really anything that you do on a web page, like that's interactive, is going to be a state change of some kind. Unless, I mean, it gets into a complex definition of what you're talking about, right? Because even with React, there's state change, but I guess the way you can think about it is it sort of tries to manage most of that for you, and we'll get into it much more detail, but you can have what are essentially stateless components in React, so they don't manage any state internally at all, and those ones are much easier to reason about. And then you have stateful components, which can have some of their own state as well. React is still managing how to change that state for you in a really sort of unique way. How to render that state change, I'll say, right? Like you need to change the state, but then React basically just says, oh, re-render now with this new state, and we'll figure it out. And we'll dive deep into that, but just about any change you make could be a state change on a web page. I would say the difference between what would typically be considered like a front-end state change and not is, are you still on that same page? Is it still the same, site, right? So like Gmail, again, going back to it, just as an example or something, if you're on there and you check one of your emails, and then that would be a state change because it didn't re-render the whole web page when you did that. And then if you click delete, okay, well, it's going to remove that row, but it's not re-rendering the whole page. So that's going to be some sort of front-end state change. Whereas, if you were on, if we go back to that first web page, where is it? Let's see here. If we were to load this page again, clicking on anything on here is not going to be a state change on the front end per se, because it's loading a whole new web page each time, right? So it's not changing the state of what's going on right there. But here is Babel, right? Every time I type a character on here, every time I type something there, it's a state change for that system, because it's not re-rendering everything, it's changing the state of what it's in right now. It's a good question. Any others right now? All right. I just want to keep moving on. Okay. Let's give this a go. I haven't reviewed this one as much as I did the other one, so we will see what this looks like. No, go to the beginning. This one has some exercises in it. All right, so the next major topic for us to talk about is React components. We talked about elements, which are these static objects or immutable objects. You can't change them. And a lot of times, I think if you really want to get good with React, it's important to understand the difference between elements and components, because this is one of the most misunderstood concepts, is people will intermix them frequently. But components are how you create React elements. They're not the elements themselves. They're just a tool for making them. Components let you split the UI into these independent reusable pieces and think about each piece in isolation from the rest of your application. And that's this sort of really powerful building block that we have. So let's map this back, right? This should sound familiar to other stuff that we've talked about in class. Does this sound like any other JavaScript concepts or programming concepts or tools that we've already talked about? Functions? Anything else? Functions are what I've emphasized more, but there's at least one other one. I mean, there's a lot of them, but at least one other major one. Arrays are sort of like that. What are methods on? An object, right? Objects are independent, reusable pieces too. The difference is an object is mutable, right? Objects can change. React tries to help you not think that way. There's a whole debate in programming right now over whether mutable objects or mutable things are good or bad, but I don't think there can be much argument that they're harder to reason about over time. You can plug in over there. That's just my charger. So yeah, it's similar to functions, or oh look, maybe objects. I didn't even remember that I had those notes in here. So all three of these, the key is, you know, again, I'm emphasizing these same concepts over and over. All three of these are tools for abstraction, which is being able to preserve information that's relevant in a given context and forgetting information that's irrelevant, right? I don't care about how my all of the details of how my car moves when I'm driving. So my steering wheel is an abstraction over how my tires turn, and my gas pedal is an abstraction over all of the aspects of how my engine is, you know, speeding up or accelerating or putting more gas into it, all of that, right? So these are just going to fall into that same category. Yeah, in my opinion, abstraction is the key to programming. Like the most important thing to think about is how can you learn to abstract stuff away, details away. If you're always trying to think about all of the details of everything that you're building, you're not going to be able to build large programs because you just can't manage that much complexity in your head at any point in time. You have to just build an abstraction, hide away most of the details, and deal with that abstraction with almost everything that you do. Examples are like abstraction from binary to machine code to higher level languages, a series of statements to a function, functions to objects, for example. Then you can get even larger, objects to modules, packages, that's an abstraction. Packages to entire applications, which is an abstraction, right? So it's like, that's how we build stuff up in programming, is piece by piece through these abstraction layers. So we'll talk about in this first section on components is functional components, which is the simplest way to define a component. And it's just a function that returns a React element. That's really all a functional component is. So here is, this should look very similar to stuff that we've done, but this is pretty much like our most basic example, right? We've got React DOM.render. We've got our component, and this is just a, I guess I'll just do this. I don't know what environment to run this in. I'll just run it in the REPL one because you can see everything there more easily, I think. That is weird. Hefty light salmon. It's going to take a little while to get everything up and running. We get rid of all this. You know, we'll just do this welcome. Okay, root works. And then once it gets up and running, this should work just fine. But this is just, this is like an example of a very basic function component. It's got the element that it's going to return right here, and then it's invoked here. So if we were to take this bit of code and I don't know if this will work or not. I'm going to try and put this in Babel, but I might be it might say like, oh, you're missing something. No, it will. All right. So there was some confusion last time over, for example, like why doesn't this stuff print twice, or does it print here? But remember, this is just a function like any other function. So it's only when we invoke it, when this function gets called, that it's going to print something. And what you'll see is this is where it's sort of hidden still, but this is pretty much where the function gets called. When it does this react.create element, inside of react create element, it's saying, oh, pass this function and then call that function. So that's why it shows up at that point in time when you're working in it. Yes?
I have a syntax question in the situation. So if instead of on line 5 where you've got the return H1, if on line 9 you put H1 there and then in curly braces call the welcome function, would it be the same thing?
Oh, okay. That's an interesting question. So let's see what's going to happen, right? Now that we're up and running. So one thing I could do here is this is just JSX, although I think this might be invalid. We're gonna see. Let me try and just call this function just right here in the JSX, and it's going to complain. I'm guessing because it's like not allowed without some sort of other markup around it. So I'm gonna put some markup around it. And that is very, very equivalent in a sense to that, just putting that element, that welcome element, self-closing one there that we had before, except for the fact that I had to put this extra div wrapper around it, right? So it added some extra markup, but that's similar. Now you'll see why you wouldn't, use that as your approach going forward. But yeah, in terms of how you want to think about something, that's a good way to think about it. And notice this might be tricky too, right? Is everything has to be closed. So right here where I called the welcome element, it might be easy to think, oh, but inside of that it closes all of its tags, so I don't need to do anything. But you need to close the call to the welcome element as well. Yeah.
If you're looking why or the importance of using the div tag in previous examples, with div with right JSX down at the bottom, right? But in the online file, it doesn't start with it. It doesn't have that. There, do you have to do that with every line of JSX, or do you not use it in certain situations?
You don't have to. You have to have. I mean, everything has to have some like tag, I guess, or some element, but it doesn't have to be div all the time or anything like that. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question exactly.
That's my question. I just didn't know if you were required to use it every time you write.
Oh no, not at all. No. You can use any HTML elements. All of them work. Div, in fact, I would argue try not to use div too much. It tends to be overused, right? Because it's just a generic block level element. Try and use ones that have semantic meaning, like mean something. Like, oh, if this is supposed to be a paragraph of text, then it's probably best to wrap it with P, because that implies it's a paragraph of text, as opposed to just a div. Yeah, this component is invoked using the same JSX syntax we were using before to invoke the HTML element, right? We were invoking the H1 directly. Now we're just invoking the welcome component. One convention, which is important because this is consistent in all React communities, that is always start your component names with a capital letter. I don't know if there's a rule that's going to prevent it. We can maybe test it real fast if it will, but it's a strong enough convention that it's more or less a rule, I would say. I don't know if that's re-rendering or not. Oops. I was going to refresh everything just because of that. That's awfully slow. All right, let's put that back. So,
Can't read.
what's that?
I can't read. It's insane.
Oh, it is give an error? Okay,
It's loading.
yeah. All right, I don't know if we're gonna make it through all of this or not. Let me click into this. So I've got an exercise here. The goal is, and maybe I'll just post these after class. Again, like I said, I didn't go through all of this. I've got some code here already in place, some JSX for you guys. And the goal will be to convert the list of heroes to render using components in this instead of the way that they're rendering right now. So what's going on, oh, I may have changed this. Let me see. Yeah, I'll have to review this hands-on exercise just to make sure that, again, it's been a little while since I looked at it. But I'll post these after class today for you guys to try and work through these, and then we can you can talk about how they're going. Okay, so let's talk about some of the other bits here of working with JSX, right? Is any JSX attributes defined on the element as if you were defining an HTML element end up getting passed into the component as the props object. So if we change our code here, and now our welcome component the function expects a props object. If we provide a name property directly on our element, that will end up on this props object. So I can take this, oops, I need to update that syntax because I don't need it that way. And you can pass anything that's an attribute on this JSX element gets passed in as part of this props object. So we could put other ones in there if we wanted. That's where this class name thing might get passed in, but you would need to apply it to the thing that you want it to apply to, you know, or we could change it to say first name, last name. I don't know. I'm just gonna say IPM because now it's not making any sense. And you'll see like it doesn't have this here anymore, but I can change my reference to the first name and it should work. And then here I could do like props.last name with that space, and then it can pull those arguments off. So anything that you put in the argument list to your component when you invoke it gets added to this props object. And that props, there's no rule that it has to be called that, but that's always what, you know, the convention is. You call the argument to your component props.
But all the props have to be called individually, or like in that case, could you do a props up first name plus props up like?
Oh yeah, like if I wanted to, I mean, I did it because I was being lazy about wanting to have a space in between them, but you would need to, so like, let me see here. Let me put a space and then plus, and then that should work because now what I have is that concatenation, right? And because this will get a little, not look pretty when I'm gonna show right now, but this is just JavaScript in here, right? So if instead I'm like, I really hate that, well now I could do a whole nother route of escaping. It could be like, let me do the string literal version. right here, I think it actually is going to throw an error. I think it has a problem with string literals inside of the JSX because those can be escaped too. And so creating the, because then you end up having to do this. Props dot first name space, like, you know, and so it doesn't end up looking that much nicer. And you end up having to nest the like way to get to the characters multiple times. But the important bit here, and this is you know critical to just writing JSX, is the knowledge that anything that you pass in or set as a property will get passed in on this first object, and that's sort of what's going on behind the scenes when it invokes it. Questions about how that works? The concept there. We'll be doing a lot of stuff with that.
I have a question. For if one of the properties that you're going to pass it when you're doing the React operator is something that's like within a database table, can you specify where within the database it's located when you do the name assignment, for example?
Yeah. So the props. Let me see how much. What all I have here, because I might emphasize some of this a little more, and then I'll come back and talk about that if I don't touch on it specifically. Try to move this. So let's walk through the example of what was happening with that, right? Again, I didn't walk through these slides like I did the other set, so there's some things here I won't remember what I have. So we're calling react-dom.render with the welcome name equals Cisco element. And remember, that's an element because that's what those are, those fundamental building blocks, right? With that, React calls the welcome component function with name colon Cisco as the props, that first argument, right? So React says, oh, take all the properties off this element, attach them as properties on this object with key values of the key being the property name or attribute name and the value being whatever it was, and then pass those in. And then the welcome component is returning the H1 welcome Cisco logic. And when that happens, then React DOM updates the DOM to match that new returned element. All right, so yeah, let me talk more about the props bit before I get into this children portion. So you were talking about trying to have something more or less dynamic, I think, right? The answer is like props are entirely static, so you can never change a prop value. It has to have been already computed when it gets passed in, which means if you were trying to hook up to a database table or something like that, what would happen is whatever was the code that was invoking it, like here, for example, maybe, you might have another function up here that might be like function get data from database, and this is going to do whatever it does, right? Connect to the database, fetch data, and then it might now it's going to return it, right? Whatever that data is. In this case, we're going to act like this is what it returned, but really it's, did some logic to return that. And then down here, what you would do is when you're rendering this, you can put JavaScript right here, just like anywhere in this, you can have this escape JavaScript. So now we can get data from database and invoke it right there. And it will make that call when it renders that element. And that will now be static for that React component. But if that data changes in the database, it's not going to change. It will have already rendered. We deal with that a different way in React components instead of being sort of live updated or connected in some way. That make sense? Other questions on this right now? Okay, so now we'll get into another important property. This is sort of a magic one, right? The JSX contained within a set of JSX tags also gets passed to the component as part of the props object. It just is the children property. I'll have an example right here. Look at this. These are using names from the class. So in this case, we'll change our welcome a little bit. And what's happening is this in here is actually still JSX. It's just a string. And it's getting passed into this welcome component as one of the props. It just happens to be the children prop. So whatever is in here is actually going to be passed in as this children prop, whatever is nested inside of our welcome. And then we can access it and render it here. And we have to render it because it won't automatically render. So if I got rid of this right here, we'll see hello comma, because yeah, we put something in here and you're thinking like, oh, this is like HTML. I nested it inside of it. It's going to render. It's not going to, because the actual component that's rendering it never does anything with its child. So if you're going to put stuff inside of another component or inside of your component, you have to access those children and render them. And we could make this as complex as we want it to be, right? This could say, oh, this is actually, we want this to be, I don't know if I is still a valid HTML element. I think it is. And it's going to render everything in here as the child, not just one tiny character, right? So we could even nest this. Oh, this is all inside of, you know, I don't know. We're going to put some other text here. This, it does have to be valid HTML structure. So I can't remember what all is allowed inside of a paragraph or a H1. Let me see. Let's just add something else. You know, I'm just adding more markup that's all sort of anything between these welcome, this welcome, that's the children for this component when it renders. So that gets passed in as the children. Questions about that? I'll get all this posted right after class because there's a lot of concepts in this. But these are sort of the foundational bits of being able to build out something with React. And then the interesting thing is, so far we've only nested what would be HTML, but really those are, you know, JSX elements inside of our stuff. But components can also refer to other components, and they can be nested inside of each other in the same way that we are nesting stuff with, let me see here. I don't know what all I captured there, but let's see if this worked. So let me swap my stuff out here. Oh, I grabbed way more than I needed. And I've got some stuff wrong. Oh yeah, way more. Yikes. Maybe. Oh no, I've got multiple versions of this too, I believe. All right, let me come back here for a second. I'm gonna try and grab just this, see if it'll work. Will that work? Grabbed a little bit extra, but not too much. All right, I think that'll work. There we go. So I'm getting at here, I guess. Let me rewind so that we have the topic up there again. Components can be composed of other components and can call them the same way that we can with the HTML. So here we've got two components. We've got a movie component and a movie list component that we've created. And the movie list, down here when we render, all we render is movie list. And what that'll do is return this, which has an unordered list, which renders movie components in it. And that's just this movie component, which you notice I didn't have to create a new movie component for each one of these. I just pass in the children and then say, oh, inside of this list item, render the child. And now I'm able to sort of compose my application from these components in this way. So we've got a movie list, which renders an unordered list with these movie elements in it. And each movie element then renders an LI element with the children, etc. And you can sort of do that all the way down. Few things to take note of here is we can intermix HTML components or elements, HTML elements, and React components calls. So the movie can be nested inside of this UL. It doesn't have a problem with that as long as this eventually returns something that it can render as HTML. It's going to be okay with that. Yes?
What does, so HTML would be easier, right?
In some respect, yeah, but it wouldn't be as dynamic or as capable.
Okay, so you're saying that with React you can do more,
Oh,
like HTML?
I mean, ultimately, it does render as HTML. One of the key things about React is, again, going back to that semantic statement I made a minute ago, like on divs, everything, you shouldn't render everything as a div, is if I read this list here, if I read what I'm doing in the code, and I have to jump around a little bit, but I say, oh, this is rendering a list of movies. Of course it is. And this is a movie in my list, right? That is very semantic. It's very much like telling me what those are in my code. Whereas if this was just HTML, like just UL and LI and stuff, you have to figure out what the semantic meaning of stuff is sometimes. Like, this is some sort of movie list, right? But this has a lot of meaning there around, this is obviously a movie I'm rendering because that's what it says it is. So that's one of the big benefits of these sort of React components, at least at first, is the concept of being able to give them these semantic names, like meaningful names, so you can understand the context of what it's about.
But you're doing so much extra work. As you're in but it's extra like lines.
It sort of is, but the minute we say, and I think I actually have it on here, I'll need to check, let me see. Oh yeah, these are some of the exercises. Convert the list of heroes to use a single hero component to create each hero and a hero list component to render the whole list. The key here will be, like, you'll start seeing a lot of the value when, oops, it's just right here. When we say something like, just reuse this movie component and this movie list component, and now let's say, and I'm not going to do all the code here right now for it, but let me say, here I will create a let movies equals, we'll just make an array of these things, right? Lord of the Rings. Because I care about silly things. Like Casablanca. By the way, this is my list, if anybody cares, of my favorite movies of all time. My 3 favorite movies. So, and that also means for those, like, one person in the world who cares, I am incredibly excited about a Bill and Ted 3 movie being made right now. So, unnaturally excited about it. But this lets you do something like, instead of me having to have these typed out, I could change this so that this movie list takes as an argument, the movies that I defined here. Let me give it a better name. Favorite movies, so that it's clear it's different. And it could use that instead of having these things hard-coded in here. And we'll get there, where you'll just be able to put your JavaScript code in this components to render these movies. And then now let's say I also want to add a list of like least favorite movies or something. You know, I could make another list and reuse those elements. And that's when you start reducing the amount of code you're writing, because I don't have to type out the HTML again, ever. I wrote HTML once, and it's just the components are managing the process of rendering all of that behind the scenes for me. So that's where it starts. Right now, it's definitely more verbose. You're just doing more work to get these. But as we start putting in some functions and other tools that help us build this stuff out, it'll really reduce the amount of HTML that you end up having to write and let you leverage them in unique ways. Some of the other benefits you get from this that we'll see over time is, let's say right now, you know, just with our existing stuff, oh, I really want to add some extra styling to this. I don't know what I want for my style here. I think this is the right syntax. Doing style is a little weird. I think it's you have to double escape, because style is a curly braced object as well. And so I think you have to do this twice to get it correct. Let me see. Yeah, but when you pass a whole style object, it's curly braces. It's not rebuilding, I don't think. Come on, this should work. There we go. So now I can change the style of all of them by changing this one React component. And I didn't have to go through and say touch a whole bunch of HTML elements. So that's very similar to like, oh, I added a class to them, but I also didn't have to do that. And it lets me just do all sorts of really powerful things, you know, across all of them. Oh, maybe I don't want these to be list items. I want them to be something else. Or I want to nest inside of the list items. I want these to be emphasized. These are important. So this is actually, yeah, you can't see that very well because of the way this is splitting up where the stuff renders, but they're huge now, right? And I did that with a very minimal amount of changes. I didn't have to go and touch all of these different places where I was rendering stuff. I only touched my component, and when it re-rendered, it rendered all of them that way. So that's where you start getting into a lot of the power that you get from this composition or this component model.
If you wanted to do a basic JavaScript method on that array of favorite movies, where would you put that? Would you put it in line 21 to like favorite movies dot sort, or?
If I wanted to like, oh, so we'll definitely get to that. I'm almost not doing it because I swear that one of my exercises is literally doing this. But I would do something like this here. I'm gonna change this now so that I will do this. I mean, you know, you guys would still need to work through it anyways if you did that. This is indented too much. You'd do something like this inside of this function, because it's just a function. I can do whatever I like to do inside of a function. So here I'll do let movies or movie list equal, and this is going to be sort of interesting. I haven't done this in a little while, so you guys may see me make a mistake or two here. I'm not sure. Oh, so this guy now took in this list of movies, right, as a prop. So I need to use my props object that gets passed in. So off of that, I'm going to do props.movies because I know that I'm passing that in. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to map that for each movie I get. This is me again. Don't worry too much about the exact syntax I'm doing here because I wouldn't probably nest stuff this much. But for each one of those, I want to render a movie with the it's just a string, so the movie, and then I'll just do it here, close that element. So now what I have is actually a list of this is an array of elements because it's called this movie component for each one of these and return an array of elements. And I think this is where I haven't done this in a while, so I hope this works. I think I can just do this here. Movie list, oh, lowercase. Come on, you can get it. Pick that up. All right, I've got. Oh, you know what's wrong? That's JSX, and so I needed to get the reference. It was putting the string movie there, but I needed it to evaluate the statement, the value of the movie variable. So I needed to put it inside of the curly braces to get movie. So see, these little gotchas will trip you up, right? It's important to be able to think about what's going on in the code at every point in time when you're working through this. But now now I don't even have to have the hard-coded list there, right? It's just generating them off of what got passed in as a prop. And so now the code's starting to look smaller than what would be the relative HTML, right? And as that grows, imagine again, we go back to Twitter or something, and you've got 100 tweets listed in the list. It's a heck of a lot smaller to write a few components that generate stuff off of each one than it is to try and list those out entirely. So let's see what we have. All right, exercise there. Let's cover React's one rule, and then we'll wrap it up, and I'll try and make sure that those exercises are ready for you guys. I'll get those sent out so that people can work through those. So React's one rule. There's other rules, but this is the most important one. Hence why it's even larger than the heading. See, I made it larger than the heading on the slide. Props are read-only. You will make this mistake, but keep this in mind. Props are read-only. Never modify the value of the props passed into a component. Don't change the value of anything on that props object because it won't work the way you think it works. Those are intended to be immutable. You should never change the value of those. So you'll notice in this example here, I got a list of movies here, but what I did was put them in a new variable. I didn't change this props.movies value. I created a new variable to store these things instead, right? Never change the value of anything passed in as a prop into your component. And we've talked about JavaScript classes before, so I don't feel like we need to go over this again. This was, I think the last time I taught this, we didn't have the intermediate one, so we didn't really dive into JavaScript classes. I'll leave this in the slides, so if somebody wants to review them when they go through these. This is just another introduction to classes. Let me double check and see if there's anything else that I have. Nope, I think that's the only other thing. Because next class, we'll be talking about class components, not just functional components. So we've got these two different ways to create React components. And the class ones are more complex, but they also give you more functionality, at least traditionally. React has introduced this whole new magical thing that I don't even fully understand called hooks that lets you pretty much do everything you can in a class component and a functional component, but it's weird. So we're gonna use class components instead for that type of logic. And then I'll get these small exercises out as well for you guys to work through. And I think you should just be able to work through them, I believe, right there in the CodePen links that I posted or whatever. Any other questions? All right.